One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. Karl-Heinz Schnibe, who actively resisted the Nazi movement in Germany, said, "For many of us, it was a time when patriotism and faith were at odds. It was a time when truth was treason." Joining me today in the Mormon Channel studio are Matt Whitaker and Rick McFarland, co-producers of the documentary Truth and Conviction, the Helmuth Hubener story. Matt and Rick, welcome very much to Legacy.
Thanks.
Before we get into this amazing story of the conviction of these young German men, let's take a few minutes and have you two introduce yourselves to our listeners.
Rick McFarland. I'm a local producer. I own a production company here in Salt Lake, doing mostly commercials and some film and documentary. And I served a German mission, and that was actually the spark as to my involvement to this story. That's where I first learned it. Actually, not on the mission, but after I had returned, I learned of the story, and it was a number of years later, 11 or 12 years after my mission, that I hooked up with Matt, and we put this together.
I'm Matt Whitaker, also a local screenwriter, filmmaker. Actually graduated from BYU film program. Did my fair share of seminary films and commercials and stuff for the church, and then fortunately fell into documentary filmmaking, and very much enjoyed that. And as Rick said, I was actually doing another documentary, World War II themed documentary called Saints at War, about LDS veterans of World War II. And it was while I was in production on that. And I think actually, Rick, it was the day that we had interviewed a German veteran of World War II who had served in Hitler's army. And it was just this fascinating interview. And from that perspective, being a member of the church and serving, on the other side, so to speak. And I think it was that same day that Rick approached me and said, "Hey, have you ever heard about the Helmuth Hubener group?" Which I'd vaguely, I'd heard about this young man who'd organized a resistance group, but just knew very little about it. And so I think that's when it started. That was back in 2001, I believe.
Was it 2001 or was it 2000?
May have been even end of 2000.
End of 2000, I think.
Yeah, that's right. We did that. So
Excellent. Aside from having been in Germany and worked on these other things, what drove you to do this? Did you feel compelled because it hadn't been done, or what was? Well,
it's as a filmmaker, there's just always this need to tell stories, and back then, being involved with documentary, you were always looking for interesting things that you had an ability to get into, and lastly, for me, it's a thing that it's kind of cathartic, but it's a way of emotionalizing, to be able to tell a story, and to be able to have a story that kind of reaches deep down in and touches nerves and heartstrings. It's a way to express emotion, and that's what filmmaking has always been to me. Whether a documentary or even commercials to some extent, an expression, a way to kind of say what's inside. And this story had been kind of in the back of my mind since I had learned it. When I saw Matt, when he was working on the Saints at War, it clicked to me that this was something that I wanted to really badly to tell. That it was something I had, and there was a sense of being compelled to do it. Unlike other documentary things, Matt and I had talked about this a long time ago, and we haven't talked a lot since. But I know that it's lived on in Matt's desires to continue to be involved with the story. But there was a sense with this one of duty in telling it. Not just that we had a story that we could do a good job telling, that we could make a nice documentary, but there was some sort of almost moral obligation, I felt, as strange as that sounds, to tell this. And I know in talking that feeling came quickly and often through the process.
Yeah, for me, when Rick introduced me to the story, I've always been interested in World War II. The fact that there were some LDS boys that started a resistance group, that's intriguing, that was interesting. But I'll tell you, for me, the turning point was, I remember, Rick, you said, there's this little group, and I think one of them's still alive, and I think he lives in Salt Lake. Let's see if we can find him. I think it was a matter of opening up the phone book, really. And then I think, Rick, you called Karl-Heinz Schnibe and just asked him, if we could come up and meet with him and just hear a little bit about his experience. And I think he said, "Yeah, sure, come on over." But it was going over and meeting with Karl and then hearing firsthand his experiences. I left his home that day knowing we have to tell this story. I mean, it was so unbelievably powerful.
I had the good fortune one time of Karl came in to the edit bay and we were going over something, and just for a few minutes afterwards talking briefly about his experience with his resistance group, and it really touched me, and he was a great individual. And it's only been 2 months ago that Karl Schnibe passed away. Yeah. So
he's a good man, a great man.
So in a nutshell, we're talking about this resistance group, which included helmuth hubener, Karl Schnibe, and Rudi Voba. Rick, why don't you give us kind of a background of what was going on in Nazi Germany at the time, and why these three felt like they wanted to do what they did?
Well, wow. Of course, the climate in Germany pre-Nazi Party was very bleak, and the people had been real decimated by poverty, and the economy in Germany was just horrible. And they had a number of leaders that had tried to kind of step up and improve things. And at the time that the Nazi Party and Hitler rose, they had success in bringing the people a sense of unity and bringing back that sense of country to the Germans, which was always very important, and a sense of identity to them. And they had, because of those core things that they were needing, the food and clothing thing, the economy had picked up, and so there wasn't the hunger and the poverty that there had been, because of the rising sense of unity that had come in the country, and the important things that happened with that, kind of the ability to be on a winning team. All of those elements combined and won over the hearts of the people so fully that they, from my perspective and from what I've studied, were just eager to accept the party and the regime and anything that would further their growing sense of security and nationality and pride, and so they embraced this radical, what history shows is radical doctrine of politic, and of course waged and involved in war and the things that we look back on and see as atrocities that happened that grew out of that, but generally as a sense of a country without the knowledge yet. For some people, at the beginning of the war, there was very little knowledge of what the extent of this political party and its intents were. And it was just a beautiful time at that time for the Germans. It was just a time of incredible euphoria, the sense of unity and growth and progression as a country. And all these programs that were happening, the Hitler Youth, in some ways, not unlike the scouting program, involved the youth and got them invigorated and off of the streets and learning skills. And it was all of these things were just a rebirth in some ways for the Germans. And it was in that climate that it was very difficult, not even that it had become difficult in society yet to be able to say anything against the society or the regime or anything like that, but it was difficult because of how good everything was going. It's the person that's crying that the sky is falling when everything appears to be beautiful and good. And so not only I always try to remember that it wasn't just that there was something bad going on and that all people had bought into that, and that the Germans were all knowingly and wittingly involved in a bad thing, but there was a very good thing happening to that country, and accompanying that were some very dark and evil things, and that was the climate kind of pre-war. And then as those things escalated, as the war came, in the name of war and in the name of the fear of treason and the fear of things happening from within, which happens in every country during war, there was a heightened sense of security that just grew and at some point became the oppressive Nazi and SS regime that was where really the story blossoms when things started to appear and also to go deeply wrong within that society, and within that is when this story then came about.
I think it's interesting that the church within Nazi Germany, members of the church, by and large, supported the regime. I mean, they saw, many of them, I should say, not all of them. There were, like any political party, there were those who didn't agree with what they were doing. But by and large, many members of the church saw the Führer, saw Adolf Hitler as this person who didn't smoke and didn't drink, and in fact encouraged people not to smoke and not to drink, who instituted a system that they called it One Pot Sunday, where essentially one Sunday a month you would skip 2 meals, and the money from that you would give to the poor.
Very interesting.
So members of the church were seeing these things and thinking, hey, this is someone who believes in many ways like we do. Now, of course, there were other things that Hitler was saying. He was always anti-Semitic and wasn't hiding that. They were able, I think, somehow, easier in retrospect to look back and see how could they do that. But at the time, they were able to justify, this is a good man doing good things for our country. And as you said, Rick, things, economically, things were burgeoning and really, many people were doing much better. So there were a lot of members of the church who bought into it.
So it shouldn't come as a surprise to know that the Helmut's branch president was a Nazi.
That's right. I mean, now we look back on it and say, how could a branch president, or a bishop be a Nazi? One of the scholars that we interviewed in doing the documentary Truth and Conviction, Alan Keel, said something that really struck me. He said, we look back and say, how could that be? He says, you got to remember, this was Nazi Germany. There were Nazis in Nazi Germany. It was a political party. He says, would you be surprised to find out that your bishop was a Republican or a Democrat? No, that's the way it was back then. Again, in retrospect, we look back and are surprised.
One other dynamic with the church, too, is that after World War I, there in Germany, there was a kind of a flight out of Germany of the members, and this hurt the membership of the church there in Germany and hurt the structure and the leadership structure there as they came to America and to other countries. And there was a sense from Salt Lake had come a directive to stay, and for people to stay and build the church there, and there was this climate, again from that of those leaders needing to stay around and to build up Germany again. And so when Germany began to build up, the church had great success during that time too. Members were gathering, church houses were being built, and so it was coinciding with a time where there was this encouragement coming, and part of that encouragement was rooted in the found in the Article of Faith that we are supposed to, as members, support the leaders of the countries that where we live, and that we are supposed to support the political process, and all of this is still what we're taught. And so that was part of also what was happening in the church, this idea of the church supporting not only the country and and the political process, but this idea that it was important for the church members to stay and build the church in Germany, and that's maybe also helps understand why the church leaders were so in some cases so very deeply involved in the party and with the Nazi leadership.
Which brings us to Helmut Hubener. He at one point got a radio from, I guess it was his brother who had served in the military. And radios at that point weren't necessarily allowed, and he began listening to some of the BBC broadcasts and started hearing some things that he believed to be true. Tell me what happened.
Well, and I think it's helpful to clarify that there was one radio allowed in Germany at the time. It was called the People's Radio, and it was a radio that received very, very localized reception. So any kind of shortwave radio or radio that might be able to pick up broadcasts from other countries or something that wasn't controlled by Goebbels was, you could be executed for having one. But his brother, who did serve in France with the German army, served in France, brought back brought back contraband, brought back an illegal shortwave radio. And Helmut, of course, eventually started tuning into the BBC broadcasts and other broadcasts from other parts of the world, hearing these things, and sensing this sounds true. What I hear on the People's Radio doesn't ring true to me now that I hear what the BBC is broadcasting. This sounds true to me. They're telling us not only their victories but their defeats as well. It sounds like I'm getting the full story here. And just little by little, certain things started happening that pushed him to this point to realize at some point, I have to do something. Now I'm responsible. Now I know something, and something inside of him at some point clicked, and he said, I have to let other people know what I know.
You're listening to Legacy on the Mormon Channel. We're visiting today with Rick McFarland and Matt Whitaker about their documentary on the Helmut Hubener story. Was Helmut a typical teenager, would you say, or?
I get the impression from what Carl would report of him and how he would talk about him that he had this little spark anyway in him, and was he was, first off, he was brilliant beyond his years. And I think he knew that a little bit. It seems like his personality was that he knew buttons to push with grown-ups, and he knew, not unlike, I don't think, my children, that maybe he's smarter than they are. And I think that must have manifested itself in many ways, and he was eloquent and outspoken, and so I get the sense that he had all the right mix-ins to be able to do what he eventually did. He was pre-programmed with a lot of those things.
So what were the events that actually drove him to the actual resistance that he?
I think there were a couple things that we know of. One of them was that there was a young man in the branch named Salomon Schwartz who was a convert to the church. He was also Jewish and had converted to Christianity and to the Mormon Church. There was a friendship between Helmut and Salomon, and on one morning as they were coming to church, there was a sign that had been put on the door that said, Jews not allowed to enter. And they knew that, everybody knew that Solomon was the only Jew in the branch. And he was not, and so Solomon, Carl tells of looking out the window and seeing Solomon standing outside and weeping because he felt like he'd been rejected by a family, That was a pivotal moment. We know from the records that Helmut went over to see Solomon that night with other members of the branch to comfort him and I think to show support. But shortly thereafter, Solomon was actually arrested and ended up going to prison camp and ended up dying there. That was one thing that happened. Something, the night of broken glass, November 9th and 10th, 1938, when, again, Helmut was a young teenager at this time, and Carl talks about that when there was a pogrom, really a countrywide persecution of the Jews, where they went around burning synagogues, and there were thousands of Jews, 26,000 Jews that were imprisoned. There were about 50 or 60 that were murdered, over this period. And
lots of looting and
lots of looting
broken
and
glass, referring to storefronts and shops.
Yeah, Jewish-owned storefronts and everything. Carl talks about being outside and seeing that happen, and going home crying to his mother, and his mother said, you're just going to have to get used to this. This is the way things are. And Carl says, from his perspective, he just couldn't accept that. And he infers that Helmut felt the same way. They couldn't accept that.
Well, and Helmut also, just stepping back just a little bit, he really didn't fit in exactly with the other boys, the Hitler Youth. He didn't seem to be of the same stock. He didn't like going out and rehearsing drills with shovels.
But he was required to be part of the Hitler Youth.
He was required, as all youth were, to be part of that, and it was not a good one. Neither was Carl. They were part of it, and get a sense that they didn't like that and fit in their stories that surround that. But I think that there was already a sense of them and me, and so when he saw the next generation Hitler Youth, the people that were out doing these atrocities and laughing about them and everything, I think there was already a separation that he felt. And so it was easy for him to look at that and say, that's wrong, where others may have been pulled along through that because it was part of what was happening. It was the evil, if you will, of the crowd. And I think he felt separated from that. So I think that was also that was easy for him to be a catalyst for this, is that he wanted to show, those that he didn't fit in with quite, he wanted to tell that they were doing wrong. And I think that's natural. That's, we see that with our kids.
And Carl tells of an experience at Hitler Youth when they were with the Hitler Youth, and the Hitler Youth leaders were trying to make them persecute this group of Jews and make these Jews do some cleaning in the street or something like that. And Carl talks about refusing to do that, and this Hitler Youth leader got in his face, and Carl punched him and left, and was kicked out of the Hitler Youth, everything. But he told that story with a smile, that's for sure. So these things, the Night of Broken Glass, the Jewish persecution, Solomon Schwartz, getting the radio and hearing for the first time what was really going on. I think all of these things kind of at some point came to a boiling point in the early spring of 1941, when Helmut, who was, he was an intellectual. He was a brilliant writer, powerful speaker, 16 years old. He'd been called as a branch secretary to type letters to the servicemen from the branch. They were out serving in the army at the time, and so he had access to this typewriter. And at some point asked the branch president, Arthur Zander, if he could borrow the typewriter and do his work from home. And it was at that point when he began typing these flyers, anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi flyers, and at first distributing them by himself, and eventually recruiting help.
What did the flyers say?
The flyers at first were simple explorations of they say and we hear, and the contradictions between that. The BBC radio, he kind of reported back. He didn't launch, to my recollection, Matt, he didn't launch initially into his own interpretations of things. He just he said, this is what is being said, and I'm going to proliferate that further. Then, as time went by, it started to be Helmut's own observations and his own conclusions made out of those observations, and the notes became increasingly more heady and more politically charged, to the point where he, on some of them, was writing "Hitler is a liar," and
Hitler is a murderer.
Hitler is a murderer, And those things were, obviously very caustic and were very dangerous to be putting out, as were the first ones to a lesser degree. But when it came to that interpretation and that kind of accusation, the stakes had been fully raised at that point.
Yeah, and it's interesting to read. Even when he first started, he was typing on he's typing up on just these little red, bright red sheets of kind of quarter sheet size paper. So it was smaller messages, Hitler is a murderer and this is why, kind of a thing. But at some point, he started taking full size sheets of white paper and filling them. I mean, and it's interesting to look at these, the ones that are left that we can look at. I mean, there are no margins. It is from edge of paper to edge of paper and typed all the way. And a couple of them even went on the back side or on two sheets. And as Rick said, it's this is where we're really seeing this young, brilliant young man getting it, seeing things that at a point in the war, this was 1941 when Germany was dominating the war. They were winning when he was starting to write these things, and he was predicting that Germany would lose the war and why they would lose the war. We look back now and can just kind of take it point by point. And he was absolutely right all the way down the line as far as why, what was going on and why Germany would lose the war. It's easy for us now to look back and say, well, of course that's the way it happened. When he was writing these things, nobody knew what was going to happen. In fact, it looked like Germany would dominate.
These were details of number of tanks as opposed to fuel supply and the ability that Germany would have to generate fuel, and one of them had a lot to do with the refueling and the regeneration of the fuel sources for all of the vehicles that would be needed and where they were, and he just did the numbers. He just kind of put on his accountant's cap and said, "It doesn't work out. Yeah. We can't do it." And of course that turned out to be true, and that was in small part one of the things that became very troublesome at the end of the war for the German army. Yeah.
And it's also interesting to see not only did he have the statistics and information to back it up, but you also get to see again this very literate young man. I mean, he's quoting from Shakespeare. He's quoting from Heinrich Mann. He's even quoting from Mein Kampf, from Hitler's book Mein Kampf, using Hitler's own words against him in certain flyers. And which is why, I mean, again, you read these, and of course, I don't speak German. I've read English translations of them. Rick, who speaks German, you read these and you see that there's one instance where instead of calling him Führer, Hitler the Führer, he puts the prefix ver on the front of it, so it's Verführer. Mm-hmm. So instead of being the leader of the people, it's the seducer of the people. I mean, just these little twists that are actually beautifully crafted. Kind of a twist of the knife to put in. So all of these things, and he was cranking these out. I mean, at some point, they got access to the branches. Yeah, the mimeograph machine. The branch had this mimeograph machine, and started cranking out copies. Once the group really started moving and going, they were at one point really cranking out a lot of copies of these. And
this, of course, troubled the leadership there in Hamburg and surrounding. It was they were convinced that there was a college professor that was heading up a very volatile resistance group. They didn't know if it was going to turn violent, and they geared up for that. And they full on went on a manhunt. They were convinced, like I say, that it was because of the writing, that it was someone much, much older than Helmuth. And even when they ended up apprehending the boys, they tortured them trying to find out who the leader was. They thought they'd got the little fish, and it was baffling to them that this young man was the source of these things. So this is evidence why, as I watched the documentary again, one of the interviewees said that the Gestapo feared a typewriter much more than they feared a pistol. Yeah, because the typewriter could bring the truth out. That's right. They felt like they can take a pistol away, but what someone reads, what someone thinks, what someone passes along quietly to a neighbor, Goebbels talked about that publicly. I mean, there really was. He understood. Goebbels understood the power of the written and the spoken word. As did Hitler. And how it could be used against them
just as they were trying to use it, from their side.
So it was just the three of them. They what finally tripped them up? What caused the problem that caught Helmut?
Well, it wasn't just the three of them. At times, they kind of unwittingly involved, in just minor ways, would involve other people, and I think that ended up being what tripped them up. The three were very loyal to each other, and but there were little leaks of thises and that's that led to their to them being arrested. And
there was a young man at Helmut's work. Helmut actually worked for the city. I mean, he was a civil servant,
office.
in the government office there in Hamburg, which is where he got a lot of the paper that he used to make these, make copies of
state-funded.
State-funded resistance. But there was a young man named Werner Kranz who worked with Helmut there. He apparently spoke French, and Helmut approached him at one point about translating these flyers into French. There were a lot of French prisoners of war, soldiers that were basically doing slave labor in and around Hamburg. The boys, everyone would see them. This was part of the spoils of war, I guess I would see. But Helmut saw these and thought, you know what? I want to get my message to them too. That's what we believe. For some reason, he approached Werner Kranz at work and said, will you translate these? And he showed him one. And Werner Kranz looked at it and immediately pushed it away. Said, "No, I'm not gonna do this." Helmut took it back from him. Well, this little interaction was observed by a man at the office who was his job was to make sure that everyone was as they called it, was patriotic. Essentially, he was to look out for any kind of subversion. And he saw this interaction. He called Werner Kranz to his office and said, what happened? And Werner Kranz told him. And so this man said, next time he comes to you, I want you to take one of those flyers. Tell him you'll do it. Take it. And apparently it was a few days later when Helmut went back to him and asked him again. Werner Kranz took it and, of course, took it straight to this man. And the man read it, called the Gestapo, and as Carl reports it, within 10 minutes, the Gestapo was there and arrested Helmut. It's February 5th, 1942. So
he's taken away. How long before the other two were implicated?
They had a understanding that they weren't going to implicate each other, and I think that lasted quite a while. I think Helmut actually endured quite a bit of brutality before he gave any names away. It hurts a little bit to think about that. A 16-year-old kid and the type of brutality that even Carl reported having after he had been apprehended. He said that he was just brutalized and beaten up in the worst ways. To think, Helmut went what he went through. But at some point, and I'm a little foggy, Matt, on the.
Well, I think it's interesting. What it's interesting to me is to note that if you read we have copies of the Gestapo records that were kept of Helmut's arrest, of his first 5 days, of interrogation, and the euphemisms are just, again, chilling to look back as they talk about that they talked to him using assiduous persuasion, which, in Nazi speak is
torture.
Yeah, torture. They tortured him. And it took about 5 days of torture before they broke him. And they did break him. They broke him till he finally gave the names of Carl and Rudy.
But even at that point, I don't think that they believed that was it.
They still thought there was an adult behind it. They still thought that there was
an adult behind it. They thought that they'd gotten the other little fish.
And in fact, they thought it was someone from the branch. Is that...
They were very suspicious that it was a member of the branch named Otto Berndt, who, for some reason, was, I guess, on their radar, on the Gestapo's radar, as someone who may not be completely loyal to the regime or something like that. And so they actually went and arrested Otto Berndt, even though Helmut did not give his name. They arrested Otto Berndt and brought him in and questioned him. They didn't torture him, but they interrogated him for 2 days And it's interesting because Rick and I had the chance to go and meet with Otto's son, whose name was Otto Berendt, as well, Otto Berendt Jr. And he related to us what his father had told him about what that was like to be interrogated by the Gestapo, them accusing him of leading this group of young resistance fighters. And it's interesting to hear. He said, I answered the question. They would throw a question. What they would do, one of the methods of interrogation was they'd sit a person in the middle of the room, and then they would put one interrogator on to their right and one to their left, and then they would fire questions at them for back and forth, and you had to turn and look at them when you answered. And it was done to trip them up and to get people to if they were covering something, to trip them up and get them to admit it. He said for 2 days they did that to him, and he said he answered every question. They would go back and re-ask questions, answered every question accurately, consistently throughout. And finally, after 2 days, they said, "Okay, you're free to go." And he said, "You believe me now that I had nothing to do with this?" And they said, "We do believe you. If you didn't, you wouldn't leave here alive." He said, "However, once we've solved the Jewish problem, you Mormons are next." That was the last thing he heard when he walked out of the Gestapo offices. Again, chilling to think what could have been, what might have been, if there had been an adult behind this group of boys.
As far as Helmut's standing in the church associated with his arrest, what happened there?
Helmut, and this wasn't right away, but the church felt it necessary to distance itself with the pressure, and I don't know all the reasons why, but with the pressure, I'm sure, from the Nazi Party and with Helmut being a member of the church eventually, and it was later on while he was in prison, he was excommunicated. He was taken from the records of the church. However, Carl, in telling this, always makes sure to say that it wasn't long after Helmut's execution that they reinstated his membership.
What you said was right on, that there was this pressure. The members of the church knew that the Gestapo was dropping in to their meetings, and that they were being watched as this American church, and especially after America entered the war, the pressure was really strong. And so when Helmut and these boys were arrested for having this resistance group, the branch president, in coordination with the district president, announced that Helmut had been excommunicated. But it is, it wasn't done the way, obviously we know that an excommunication in the church, there was no high council, there was no, church court, so to speak. It was just very quickly done, And again, I believe, and Rick and I have had the chance to meet with the sons of this branch president, and to get their perspective on why they did that. And it seems clear to me that at least one of the reasons that he did that was to distance the church from what these boys had done, to essentially make sure that what was happening to the Jehovah's Witnesses in Nazi Germany, where they were all being sent to concentration camps, to make sure that those kinds of things didn't happen to the LDS Church.
So we could maybe safely say it was more of a gesture toward the government.
I think so, because it wasn't done, again, through the channels. It couldn't have been done through the channels. It was cut off. They could not interact in the same way they had previous to the war with the leadership of the church, and so it couldn't be done, and it shouldn't have been done that way. Again, we believe that this was a gesture that was meant to be a saving thing for the people, but that it was not born out of anyone's belief that Helmut had done something that had merited that. And we can all have opinions that surround that. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, to distance it. Again, not only had Helmut been a member of the church and had been a scribe, he'd been a secretary, and had calling there. He was closely tied in that way, but they also found the typewriter and the mimeograph machine that were the church's, and they knew that those had been involved. The church looked at that point very bad in the Nazis' eyes. And they were convinced that this went further. And I think that it was just a quick thing to do for the church to be able to show that, you know what, no, this began and ended with Helmut alone, which it did. And
it's interesting to note as well that shortly after the war was over, Rick and I have seen Helmut's membership record, and written on it is excommunicated by mistake. It's interesting to say that there wasn't even they didn't feel it was necessary to do a reinstatement, because the in quotations the excommunication was really not valid, in the first place. But as Rick said, was probably very helpful in preserving the church throughout Germany, at that time.
So Helmut is convicted to death, and the other two are sent to prison camps. How did that all transpire?
Well, as time went by and as they interrogated more and more, they finally were led to believe that it was Helmut. They found the things in his apartment. They saw where things had born. As they put where the ideas had been born, they found that it must have been, as Helmut was saying, it must have been him, and he was trying to say him alone that had done this. And, one of the real touching parts of telling the story when you hear Carl talk about this is his relaying what must have happened. He wasn't there, but what must have happened, what Helmut must have said. He felt that Helmut's taking more of the blame, perhaps, in this than he should have, was an effort to save Karl-Heinz and to save Rudy. And he feels like this was the case, that Helmut kind of bore heroically the burden of this, and that they let the others off the hook, being unwitting and or deeming them as unwitting participants in this thing. So they received hard labor camp, and Helmut was executed by guillotine.
I think it's when they went to court, and they went to what was called the People's Court. This was Hitler's court, and it was in Berlin, and it was judges that were appointed by Hitler that were hearing, this trial of these three, these young men who, these resistance fighters, and Carl was standing at that point. Carl and Rudy were standing next to Helmut during this process, and that's where you get to see, Helmut. Although during the torture and interrogation they had broken him, this is where he finally stood up, and as Rick alluded to, really took all the blame. And from Carl's perspective, he watched his best friend kind of really take all of the focus and all the blame on himself, and got in the judge's face, and started bantering with the judge, and asking question. The judge would ask him, "Do you really believe that Germany would lose the war?" And Helmut responds, "Of course I do. Don't you?" And going on to really kind of get in his face and expose, or at least attempt to a certain extent to expose, in this public forum, Nazi Germany for what it really was, to put a crack in the veneer, of what was Nazi Germany, taking all that on himself, so that at the end of the day, even though Carl was 18, was legally an adult, and there's some evidence that they were really going to try and go after the adult. It would be much easier for them to execute this adult than to execute these minors. But
they actually had to change a law, which they did. Despite it being wartime and all of these things happening, they went through in their legislative process. They changed a law to allow a minor to be executed for a crime of treason, and that law actually stands on the books. Which brings up another thing. I think it's, Helmut didn't change the course of the world with what happened, and oftentimes in retelling stories like this, you want to see that it was the cause of the German demise, but it wasn't.
Right.
But the extent of what he did and the things that he did, the reach of the things that he did, are I think it's important to realize how deeply he did cut into the Nazi flesh when he. later on, let's see, he had been sentenced to death, and there was an appeal for clemency that had come actually from the Gestapo member that had apprehended him. It came a clemency request that went up the channels of the Nazi Party to Hitler and was denied on Hitler's desk personally by him. We know that Hitler knew of this resistance and was frustrated by it, and that the party had put enormous efforts into finding it. And he had scratched that veneer, like you said, Matt. He had done that. If that were the only thing he had done, that would have been monumental. But the fact that he did anything in those circumstances is, I think, the lesson that he has taught the rest of the world. And the reason that we felt compelled to do the documentary, he did something under those extreme pressures. He did the type of things that most men would cower to do, and I think that's what came of the Helmut Hubener group. That was the lesson that was learned there.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the fact, by something that you mentioned, Rick, is that it was the Gestapo agent, and we know his name, we know who this person was, who was so intent on hunting them down, who after he caught them, after he read all these flyers, after he interrogated Helmut, after he was sitting in the court when Helmut was sentenced to death, applied for clemency. In fact, again, took it all the way up to Hitler. Something got to him, you know. Yeah, you're right that you know, Helmut's and the Hubener group's actions didn't, you know, change the outcome of the war directly, but it did affect people around them. You know, if you look at it, got to this Gestapo agent, and as you know, as is mentioned in the documentary when we interviewed Doug Tobler, he talked about the fact that Helmut Hubener and this group, and like other groups like them, became the soil out of which the new Germany grew after the war. They looked back and saw there were so many of them who didn't stand up, who didn't do anything, or who participated on the other side, but they were able to look back and say, Helmut Hubener, this group, these were Germans, they stood up. That's who we're naming our streets after. That's who we're naming our buildings after. You know, that's who we're honoring, are those who did stand up against Hitler, you know, and paid with their lives for doing it.
One of the emotional memories I have of the documentary was the interview with Günter Grass when he was a Nobel laureate that we interviewed, who had written about Helmut in one of his in his Nobel Prize-winning book. Örtlich betäubt was the name of the book.
For those of us who don't speak German, local anesthetic.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. And we interviewed him. We found out later this had been buried deep within the memory of Günter Grass, and he wasn't going to say anything about it, and no one else could remember or knew. But we found out that Günter Grass was a member of the Hitler Youth, and that he was later, as he went through the ranks of the Hitler Youth, he had joined the Nazi Party, and he was a self-proclaimed, later in life, a self-proclaimed pacifist, and so it was very difficult for him to admit that he had been part of this. We didn't know that at the time of the interview, and one of the things that he said, again, just stands out poignantly in my mind. He kept asking the rhetorical question, why didn't I know? Why didn't I do what he did? How could I not see it and he see it? I thought that was interesting, especially knowing that he was in a very similar situation as Helmut. He would have been a boy in the Hitler Youth. How did he not see it and know? And how did Helmut? What made up this Helmut Hubener that he could see that? And he kept asking that in various ways, and we included it in one of its forms in the documentary. But it just again and again, how did I not see it? And
you could feel the angst that he still felt, 60 years later. How did he see it and I didn't? Why did he do something and I didn't? Yeah.
One of the quotes from Karl Heinz said, though, that even though they did something, they didn't blame the people who didn't, because things were so difficult, choices were so hard to make based on patriotism and truth. So
yeah, and that was one of the great blessings of being able to spend time with Carl Schnibe, is that he was a man who was at peace with what had been done to him, and had actually a very, very personal experience because after Helmut was executed and Carl and Rudy were sent to these labor camps for the remainder of the war, and then 2 weeks before the war ended, Carl was forced into the German army, never given a weapon. They sent him to Czechoslovakia, and he woke up one morning surrounded by Russian tanks, and then was captured and spent the next 4 years as a Russian prisoner of war, up in Siberia. Didn't come home, so he was a prisoner for 7 years total. Came back barely alive, weighing about 90 pounds, with a lot of physical and emotional and spiritual scars, And there was a miraculous moment of healing for Carl with his new church leader, Otto Berndt, who we discussed earlier, who helped Carl be able to forgive these people that had tortured him and murdered his friend. And Carl talks about it. I mean, he was miraculously healed both physically and spiritually and emotionally, so that years later he could look back on that and not have bitterness, and not have the baggage that comes with those kinds of experiences, but instead be able to look back and as he said, not judge them, not hate them for what they'd done, but just understand it was a tough time. It was a tough time being in the middle of it. We see things now, retrospect, black and white. They're bad Nazis and good resistance fighters. But the reality was, in the middle of that, there was a lot of gray. It was a really tough time to make decisions, to know what was right.
I have it on pretty good authority that the original title for your documentary was going to be Truth and Treason.
That's correct.
Or something like that.
Yeah, we actually had 1,000 DVDs printed that said Truth and Treason on them.
And it came out being Truth and Conviction. Was it just too hard of a topic to tackle with that kind of a title, or?
There were actually a number of reasons that that the title changed. Some of them had to do with the implications of the title. And some of them had to do with some other publications that shared the same name. So it wasn't all just one thing, but it definitely did have. There was definitely a spearhead on the name Truth and Treason that may have been a little bit too pointed for the distributor and for the church who was supporting this product, sure, and for BYU. So there definitely was a kind of a grab bag of reasons.
It's hard to fathom all the things that one can take from this story. The forgiveness of Brother Schnibe, the making the right choice, of Helmut. And what can you suggest to our listeners?
Well, this has continued to be an ongoing lesson that I somehow have need to learn in my life, and I continue to learn it. I think it started for me on my mission. I experienced, to a just a real dramatic degree, a lot of culture shock when I arrived there in Germany and saw the cultural differences and the beauty that was there. And I had a hard time at first reconciling the beautiful, just timeless nature of Europe and the devout way that people would worship in their churches, and the beauty and music and culture that would come there. Reconciling that both to my religion and where I fit in that, and how these people could be so devout and yet not have what I believe to be all of the truths that were there, and then also to be there in Germany where there was so much beauty and so much to be had of good, and yet these, so many atrocities happened. I had a hard time reconciling all of those things. They seemed to kind of collide together, and I wanted things to be easy. And I'd grown up with answers being very easy. You ask a question and you got an answer that was definitive. And I continually have learned from that point on, and this was also a part of that. This documentary taught me again that that truths are to be had in sometimes in areas of gray, and that it's not always so easy to see what the right things are. When you know that they're right and you identify them, whatever their color, whether it be on the one side or the other, you recognize it, and the Spirit testifies that they're true. But it's been important, to see that it's a difficult thing to know, despite everything going around you, for Helmut to know that what he was doing is right and to have that conviction. Despite the pressures, despite all of what would be logical or would be comfortable or would be prudent or advised, despite all of that, to do what you know to be true, I think is the lesson that, again, was taught to me out of that.
Matt?
I think that many lessons, and, one of the things, what you just said, Rick, I mean, I have a son who's just older than Helmut was when he, was executed, and I hope that he'll stand up. I hope that I'll stand up for what is, for something that I know is right, no matter what the consequences are. But the other thing for me that was also very powerful was, in fact, Carl's ability, and I didn't know Rudy. Rudy passed away in the early 90s from cancer. But I understand it was the same for him, this ability, a miraculous ability to forgive horrible mistreatment, horrible injustices, and to be able to completely and wholly forgive that, and to live a life of peace, after that. I mean, if Carl can forgive having been tortured, I can forgive my neighbor who offends me, or somebody who does something against me. If they could forgive that, then I definitely can forgive the little things that happen in my life. And I think that's something that we can all think about.
In the few minutes that Helmut had before he was executed, he was given the opportunity to write 3 letters. One of those letters survived through the years, and I have a copy of it here. Matt, would you read that for our listeners?
And this was, he wrote 3 letters, one to his mother, one to his grandmother, and then one to a family in their branch, the Sommerfeld family, who were very close to him. He spent a lot of time at their home. And it was their letter, it was the only one that survived. And it says, "Dear Sister Sommerfeld and family, when you receive this letter, I will be dead. But before my execution, I have been granted one wish to write 3 letters to my loved ones. I want to thank you for the letter you sent to me, dear Sister Sommerfeld, which they withheld from me. I also want to thank you for the many happy hours I was able to spend in the circle of your family. Please remember me kindly. I am very thankful to my Heavenly Father that this agonizing life is coming to an end this evening. I could not stand it any longer anyway. My Father in heaven knows that I have done nothing wrong. I know that God lives, and He will be the proper judge of this matter. Until our happy reunion in that better world, I remain your friend and brother in the gospel, Helmut."
Thank you very much. We've been talking today with Matt Whitaker and Rick McFarland about the story of Helmut Hubener and his resistance during the Nazi regime in Germany. Thank you very much for being here. It was a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Nathan.